Just a year ago, almost two-thirds of oil flowing into Turkey came from Russia. Today, that number is collapsing. Turkish refiners are quietly turning off the Urals tap, swapping Moscow's barrels for Iraqi, Kazakh, and even Brazilian crude. It's a change that's cutting into Russia's war-funding Lifeline, one tanker at a time. Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. As you've just heard, in today's video I want to talk to you about what's happening in the relationship between Turkey, or Turkey if you like that pronunciation better, and Russia, because up until now, Turkey has been Russia's third largest buyer behind India and China of oil products. Turkey has taken a really interesting middle ground because despite the fact that it's a member of NATO, it's kept its relationship with Russia going throughout the war in Ukraine. President Erdogan and President Putin have had numerous meetings and they've actually wanted to strengthen their relationship. And obviously that goes against the grain in terms of what the rest of NATO is doing. And up until this point, it seemed that Turkey was quite happily buying as much Russian oil as it could get its hands on. Now, in terms of the amount of money that Russia is making from the relationship with Russia, I thought it was worth having a look at how much it's purchasing currently. In terms of crude oil, Turkey takes around 6% of Russia's total exports, and crude oil is basically the very raw form, which you would then take into your refineries and then put it through your own processes to break it down into things like gasoline and diesel and jet fuel. And in terms of what that 6% equates to in monetary terms, well, if we're talking around about $55 to $65 per barrel on average, then Russia would be earning around about $600 million per month, and that equates to around $7 billion per year, so a big chunk of change. But interestingly, Turkey is a much bigger buyer of oil products, so things that have been through the Russian refinery process, so the finished products essentially. They're purchasing between 25 and 30% of Russian products. And the reason why that's important is because that's much higher margin business for Russia. When you're selling crude oil versus gasoline, you sell gasoline at a much higher price and therefore you're making much more profit on it. And also, there's a lot of people employed in Russia in the refinery industry. So it actually is better from Russia's point of view to sell the finished product rather than just selling the raw material. And if we're talking between $80 and $90 per barrel for the finished product, so significantly higher than the crude product, we're talking somewhere in the region of $1.3 to $1.7 billion per month that Turkey is paying to Russia. And that equates to between 15 and 20 billion per year. So in total, over the past few years, Turkey has been buying something in the region of $25 billion worth of oil directly from Russia. So it's a really important customer. But things are starting to change. In 2024, Russian oil equated to 65% of all of Turkey's oil imports. That's combined crude and products. In 2025, up until October, that's fallen to 47%. That is a massive change. So Turkey is proactively changing its buying patterns. It's reducing the amount it's buying from Russia and increasing it from other countries because Turkey's demand for oil isn't going down, it's going up. But it's just deciding that it wants to start buying less from Russia. And obviously, that's bad news from Russia's point of view because they can't find many other countries of Turkey's size to replace those lost sales. Now, Turkey runs 5 oil refineries. 4 of them are operated by a company called Tüpraş, and apologies for my pronunciation on that, but my Turkish isn't that good. And they process around about 615,000 barrels per day. And another company called Sokar has a refinery called Star, which processes around 200,000 barrels per day. So in total, Turkey is producing around 815,000 barrels of finished products every single day. And they cover all of Turkey's needs, but actually they're producing more than Turkey uses. So those refineries are actually exporting up to 30% of their output to other countries. And many of those countries are in Europe because of Turkey's location. It's located close to Europe. And so Turkey is making a good profit from selling oil that it's buying in from places like Russia, putting it through its refinery process and then selling it on into Europe. But as a result of the increase in the sanctions and the fact that both Europe and the USA are now clamping down on anything that has Russian origin, Turkey has decided to pull back on using Russian oil because it wants to keep selling all of those oil products into Europe because it's making good profits from it. But what it doesn't want to do is find that its refineries have been sanctioned because they're using Russian oil as their raw material. So that's one of the reasons why Turkey has pulled back because of the increase in the sanctions. Turkey knows that although it could use that oil for its own purposes, as it has been doing for the last 3.5 years, if it wants to sell anything on, then the origin of that is going to be traced. And if it's found to be Russian, then those refineries could actually be hit with secondary sanctions. So that's one of the key issues that Turkey is now facing. It wants to keep its business and its economy going, and it can buy oil from other places. As I said at the beginning of today's video, it can buy from Iraq or Brazil or Kazakhstan or anywhere, basically. So from Russia's point of view, this is a serious problem because in terms of the amount that Turkey has pulled back, it's currently buying around 317,000 barrels per day from Russia, down from 422,000 last year. So Russia has lost all of that income from those 105,000 barrels of oil per day. That's not per year, that's per day that Turkey has pulled back on that. And as I said, Turkey is buying from Iraq. It's actually increased its imports from 99,000 barrels to 141,000 barrels per day. That isn't by chance. You don't just do that by mistake. That is a strategic move by Turkey. They are deliberately changing their buying patterns as a result of the sanctions. And they're also buying from places like Kazakhstan, Brazil, and Angola. So is this Turkey actually phasing out all of its purchases from Russia? Because if it is, that represents a serious problem from Russia's point of view. So in terms of looking at what's at risk here from Russia's point of view, the current sales that it's continuing to make to Turkey are 317,000 barrels per day of crude oil and 300,000 barrels per day of refined products, so diesel and gasoline. And if we look at the revenue that Russia is earning from that currently, the 317,000 barrels of crude is bringing in around about $600 million per month for Russia. And the refined products, the 300,000 barrels, if we assume an average price of around $90 for those refined products, then that's bringing in at least $800, possibly $850 million per month. So Russia is currently earning around $1.5 billion per month from Turkey. So obviously, over the course of a year, that would be $18 billion at the current rates. If Turkey switches off the tap and decides that it wants to abandon all Russian oil, that's going to be another huge blow for the Russian economy, but not just for the economy, also for the oil industry. We've talked about this many times before, but the oil industry needs to keep operating at maximum capacity to keep everything flowing nicely. Once you start losing sales and you can't produce all of the oil because you've got nowhere to store it, you have to pull back on production, and that can cause major problems further down the road if you try to step the production back up again. So Russia is facing not just monetary problems, but also operational issues as a result of these lost sales. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because up until this point, the relationship between Turkey and Russia looked to be very strong. As I mentioned earlier, the heads of both of those states have had numerous meetings over the past 3.5 years, irrespective of what's happening in Ukraine. They've been talking about strengthening their trade relations, and Turkey has been a huge buyer of energy products directly from Russia. Now, that's caused some issues with regards to the rest of NATO. They're not very happy that Turkey is oblivious to what's happening in Ukraine. They've been encouraging Turkey to try to get on board in terms of the sanctions, but President Erdogan has refused to issue any sanctions against Russia. But what we've seen in today's video is that the purchases of oil directly from Russia have reduced significantly over the past 12 months. This time last year, Turkey was sourcing almost 2/3 of all of its oil products and crude oil directly from Russia. Today, it's less than half. So that represents a significant reduction. And the reason why Turkey is doing that isn't because it's now getting behind all of the sanctions and has decided to join the West in being negative against what Russia is doing in Ukraine. It's because Turkey itself is running the risk of being hit with secondary sanctions. So the way that the sanctions have been ramped up over the past 6 months or so is that everybody is now trying to identify where you are sourcing your oil from. So if you're an oil refinery, in the past, you could buy Russian oil, put it through your refinery, and then sell the finished products as your own finished products. And nobody would really bother tracing where you bought that crude oil from. However, now there is a real focus on if you're using Russian oil as your raw material, then you shouldn't be allowed to sell those finished products to countries that have got sanctions against Russia, because effectively what you're doing is funding the war in Ukraine by allowing Russia to sell all of those products to that refinery and then treat those finished products as if they had nothing to do with the Russian sanctions. Obviously, that doesn't really work. So the ramping up of the sanctions and trying to identify where the oil has come from is a problem from Turkey's point of view, but also the recent announcement that Lukoil and Rosneft have now been directly sanctioned by the USA means that nobody can deal with those two operators. And obviously, as the biggest two oil companies in Russia, they're selling the most amount of oil. So a lot of that oil would have been going to Turkey. But interestingly, those sanctions have only been announced within the past few weeks. The fact that Turkey has been pulling back over the last 12 months shows that Turkey is becoming more and more concerned about being hit with secondary sanctions, because the Turkish economy is not in good shape. If you follow the channel, you'll know that we've talked a lot about Turkey over the past few years, and Turkey has very high inflation, very high interest rates, and it's struggling in terms of growing its GDP and trying to bring in more business. So Turkey needs to develop its trading relations with countries in Europe. So the last thing that it needs at the moment is to be hit with secondary sanctions that would stop it doing any more business. So we are gradually seeing Turkey pulling back from this relationship with Russia. I think the increase in the sanctions over the past couple of months, and particularly over the past few weeks, with Lukoil and Rosneft being sanctioned, means that Turkey will probably accelerate its pullback from Russia. It may be down to less than 30% in terms of its purchases from Russia within the next 6 months. And basically by the end of 2026, if things carry on at the current rate, we could see Turkey pulling out of this relationship entirely. Now, that would be an absolute disaster from Russia's point of view, because they're already facing problems with regards to India and China pulling back on their purchases. I talked in a recent video about the fact that the 4 big state-owned oil businesses in China have now cut back on their orders from Russian oil. So they're looking elsewhere around the globe rather than Russia. So if this is happening to all of their big buyers, it means that Russia simply won't be able to produce as much oil because nobody wants to buy it. So that's a massive impact in terms of loss of revenue. They're going to be losing tens of billions of dollars, but also the oil business in Russia could find itself in a world of pain if it has to cut back on its production levels, because that's not the way you want to run an oil operation. You want to keep it at maximum flow. You don't want to be trying to choke the amount of oil coming out of the ground, because if you do, that could cause serious problems, well, immediately, but also further down the road if you try to ramp things up again. And let's not forget that a lot of these facilities are in very cold areas in Russia, and we're now going into the winter period. So you don't really want to be playing around with your production levels right now. But the overall summary of today's video is that what we've seen from today's data is that Turkey is now making a tangible move to pull back on the amount of oil that it's buying from Russia. It's come down from 65% to 47% of Turkish demand over the past 12 months. That's likely to accelerate over the next few months as the secondary sanctions start to bite. All of this is really bad news for Russia because they're losing revenue, they're also losing their production, and they're losing a key relationship in terms of one of their main allies. So I wanted to post this story really just to update you on the fact that Turkey is moving away from Russia, and that's bad news for Russia because it's one of its biggest purchasers. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. That's what I'm trying to do, provoke some thoughts for you. So hopefully it has provoked at least one. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. And thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you're a patron or a YouTube member, thank you for that long-term support. And if you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, I really, really appreciate that. Thank you so much, and here's something to put a smile on your face.